So let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here. The first item here is really, consistent with what I reported last week. We've been reporting on SNMP Reflection attack activity. You know, this has been around for years. I don't want to make it look as if this is some type of a new attack activity. I remember being in discussions with some peer organizations about this topic and the concerns around it, and actually having some real events associated with it that were rather significant. A lot of that got locked down, but I think one of the sort of the underlying point that I'm trying to make here is the fact that most of these things don't really go away, you know, just because you know about it and even have ways to deal with it. This is a case where there's still exposed SNMP devices, SNMP-enabled devices out on the internet, and they're being used for attacks. But the good news is it has seemed to have tapered off over the last few weeks here. So we hope it stays that way. On a similar note, you know, we've been reporting on this port, scan sources on port 4143 UDP as well as 4183 UDP, and basically they were, 4143 is mostly U.S. and the 4183 mostly in Latin America and Europe. That also has been sort of tapering off, comparatively speaking. We still have not really kind of determined what that was, but it definitely has some strange characteristics around it. John, I think you had sort of indicated that it looks like, sort of a variety of internet-connected devices.
Yeah, it looked like a lot of those embedded type devices, DVRs, right, home routers, DSL modems, things like that.
And we had speculated sort of a P2P activity going on here, but
suspected, but I never actually saw two devices talk to each other, so it's kind of weird.
Well, and to put it in context, it's not as if there are huge numbers of addresses doing this, so they would have to be, if they're doing basically a random search, it's going to take a long time to find a peer that has this. So in any case, that activity seems to be tapering off, still tracking what's going on there. Next item here is probes on port 1153 TCP. This is registered. Excuse me, thank you. 1158. I'm so used to saying 53. So it's 1158 TCP. That's DB Control OMS. OMS standing for Oracle Management Service. We're showing actually 180 days of activity here. I don't think we've reported on this before. When I did a quick search,
I don't recall it either.
I hadn't seen it, but it's not as if this is actually new activity. So kind of wish we had reported on before. In any case, there are basically two sources from China that are scanning on this port. They are working basically on independent intervals. But it's interesting to note that most of the probes come from one address, and they appear to be very random. And then maybe about 1/10 as many of the probes come from, and I'm roughly estimating here, come from another address. And those are very frequently successful connections. That is, there are at least other flag activities as opposed to just sort of a SYN packet sent. And so it appears as if they may be actually working together. That is, one to identify where connections are accepted or some kind of response is received, and then the second one to go through and do a further investigation and perhaps profile, or maybe even to do, again, I haven't seen specific evidence, but perhaps to do password guessing or something, or vulnerability checks, that kind of thing. It turns out that at least one of those addresses, I did a quick check, it was the one that was doing the frequent probing and scanning activities, also scanning on other ports that some of which are really very closely related. 1433, which is Microsoft SQL database, this being the 1158 being associated with Oracle database. 1521, that's actually another Oracle.
That's another Oracle, yeah.
Another Oracle port as well. 1723, a little bit of anomaly there. That's a H3.
Is it? I'm not sure if it is or not.
Oh, shame on me, I should have checked. Yeah. I thought I knew and then I forgot.
I feel like that might be another Oracle TLS listener port or something, right, but I could be wrong.
And Matt's going to look it up while we talk a little bit more here. Port 3306 is MySQL database, which happens to be owned by Oracle as well. And then 3389, it's a remote desktop protocol, which is basically, obviously remote desktop protocol. We see that frequently.
That's a good thing.
1723 is point-to-point protocol, actually.
P2P, okay.
So. PPTP.
Oh, PPTP, yeah, so it's that PPTP tunneling protocol. Yeah. Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah, perhaps a remote access path or something to be vulnerable. So in any case, keep an eye out for those types of activities because there certainly are actors that are trying to get into your database or your enterprise. By the way, I think in many cases that, we've probably said this before, but I think many cases these database penetrations aren't necessarily going after the database itself. I think they're looking for an avenue into the enterprise. That is, if you're operating a database server, invariably you're going to have some path to get data in there or manage the data, other transactions that are taking place, and so it's an opportunity to perhaps use features of the database that are often overlooked to be able to get administrative access to the machine,
laterally.
Perhaps, and then perhaps move laterally. So exposure of a database is oftentimes sort of from an attacker's point of view, a potential gateway.
I am thinking about it, though. For some attackers, the whole point is simply gaining access to the database and dumping the contents to pastebin.
Maybe.
To say, hey, we're Lead Hacker Crew 27, we got into somebody's database. We had no idea we were trying to get into the database, but when we found it, here it is.
Yeah,
right.
I agree. That's absolutely true. But in this particular case, I'm speculating based on the remote desktop protocol, the PPTP, those types of things that kind of suggest it's really kind of just trying to get access. Next item here, the top 10 most probed ports. At the top of the list, port 22. We've been talking about that. 445 TCP, no surprise there. 1433. We've had a couple move up, port 80 TCP, and 8 ICMP moved up a few slots. We haven't looked at that for actually forever, so I'm going to go ahead and take a look at that in a moment here. Port 9200 TCP.
Elasticsearch.
Oh, the Elasticsearch.
But I think there's something else
we're going to look
too,
at that
right?
a little bit more closely in a moment here. And 1900 UDP associated with SSDP, which is used in reflection attacks. Now, one of the significant items here is that about half of this is associated with others. And so the question was, well, how many others? And so in this particular case, and this actually being from May 4th, we had 1,495 other ports and protocols that had been probed in the context of this activity. We're just showing the top 10, so you can imagine that what's going on there. And I thought, maybe there's some trends associated with this. So we went back and extracted the data. This isn't actually one of our sort of automated reports, so I had to do it in a spreadsheet. But in this case, it's basically showing over the last 5 months or so the number of ports that have been probed on a particular day associated with this probe tracking activities. Frankly, I don't see any direct correlation to the size on the pie chart, but it is kind of interesting that there are surges in time where there are lots of different ports that are being probed on a given day. I want to make a distinction here. This is a case where we're seeing lots of probing activity, 2 different ports, that's distinct from a single address that might be probing lots of ports on a particular address. Right. And so there's a subtle distinction there. So there is a distinction. I don't know what else to say. Interesting graph. If you if you have any thoughts or questions about this, I'm certainly welcome to entertain those. As I mentioned, we'll take a look at the ICMP 8 activity. ICMP 8 is a ping request, but I don't know that it actually gets used all that much for a ping request. I think on a Windows system, if you send a ping, it's some kind of a UDP packet. It's like
some systems use UDP, others use TCP. I forget which is which.
Right.
But in any case, this is one that's registered for ping requests. And oftentimes this gets used to basically scan for addresses that respond. And then there might be a follow-up activity to probe for what services might be open on that particular service. So that's one of those distinctions that I was trying to make earlier. That is, if you find an address that responds and then the address comes in and probes across the number of different services, it will register in our analysis differently than a case where you're just probing across and then changing it to a different port and then to a different port or something like that. So, but anyway, what is interesting about this is the graph actually has a few different characteristics. One is that you can see that there's actual regular probing activity on a sort of a daily basis, where there's, basically they're very close together, but there's spikes of activity. We're looking at a year of data, so it did get kind of smushed together. Smushed is a technical term. But in any case, they kind of get, but you can see the spacing where there's a daily probing activity, but you also see these sort of big jumps and drops in activity that are taking place. And that is a clear indication that there are just a small number, a lot of the activity or a large portion of the activity can be associated with a small, basically a single user activity.
Single actor,
yeah, the single actor where they've started activities, it's taken place, and then it goes away for a little bit, and then it comes back, and that doesn't happen by accident. So lots of other noise underneath there, but some of the most aggressive actors in terms of participating in this type of activity, they're not hiding. That's what it comes down to. Okay, scan probes on port 9200 TCP. As we said, Elasticsearch, Lexmark printers apparently answer on this port.
Some sort of web access, WAP.
Oh yeah, there's a wireless access service that is used as well. In fact, that's the registered, how it's registered in IANA as the registered port. So we're not exactly sure what this is targeting. It's been going on since I think the beginning of March, where, I mean, obviously other noise off to the left there, but we're showing 90 days of activity, and there has been an increase, and that continues to take place, and obviously triggering some alerts from our point of view. And in terms of the top 10 most sources doing the probing, not a lot of movement here. We've been basically seeing port 445 at the top of the list, ICMP type 3, code 3 activity on there. That's basically you can't get there from here.
Something like that.
Yeah, I generally characterize ICMP 3 and ICMP 11 is you can't get there from here.
Okay.
It's kind of like a Jersey barrier on the highway in New Jersey. Followed by port 23 TCP, ICMP 8 that we talked about, and then some others. The one thing I wanted to share with you, a little more investigation, is port 17788 UDP. We'd investigated, first of all, we'll take a look at port 23. I digress. Looking at the last 90 days of activity, this is one that's very significantly associated with Internet of Things, devices that are being probed. They happen to be serving Telnet and oftentimes have default passwords that the users, owners of those devices didn't know need to be reset. We clearly see this botnet activity on April, looks like just 17th or 16th or so. We saw an increase in the activity on that port, and then it seems to be tapering off a little bit. There seem to be some other things going on in the creating some noise here and the sort of the typical decay. I'm not exactly sure what might be causing that, but nevertheless, it's there. So back to 17788 UDP. John, I think you'd investigated this a little bit more. It looked like BitTorrent activity.
Right. There's like little info hash requests and things that we see in this traffic. So I don't know. It looks like BitTorrent to me, but I don't know anything that's officially assigned to this that I'm aware of.
And since the activity had been growing, it was one of the things that I felt needed to be investigated a little bit further. So we do have some analysis that picks up on sort of correlation activities, and it did correlated to a website that was basically advertising video content that appeared to me to be pirated content. It didn't appear to be sanctioned by the organizations that would normally be offering that sort of content. Right. So my suspicion is here that this is actually a BitTorrent network, probably not performing attack activity, but more along the lines of perhaps distributing some
streaming video content.
Streaming video
pirated
content that's been pirated of some sort. So that's the theory behind this. And so from a security standpoint, probably somewhat innocuous, but if you see this type of activity, something you probably want to be paying attention to, particularly on an enterprise. You don't want that sort of content floating around your enterprise. That's our theory.